Scarlett Monroe had always been the kind of woman who kept her world perfectly aligned. Disciplined, careful, composed, a walking contradiction of grace and guarded fire. But Las Vegas had a way of pulling at the threads of even the strongest fabric. And that night, in a city drenched in gold and sin, where neon promises danced on every corner, she found herself unraveling with every sip of tequila that tasted like freedom and regret. Laughter echoed too loud, her friends egged her on, her loneliness howled beneath her red lipstick, and somewhere between blurred edges and strobe lights, her world tipped into a dangerous blur. When she woke up in a penthouse suite, she had no memory of booking, wrapped in silk sheets she'd never seen, and beside a man whose presence felt too still to be real. She froze, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on a marriage license lying innocently on the nightstand, like a loaded weapon, her name scrawled in legal ink right next to his. Luca Kingsley. Her pulse roared, stomach turning, heart pounding against the unfamiliar weight of a wedding ring, glinting mockingly on her finger. And when the man beside her finally stirred, turning to reveal a face so devastatingly handsome, it felt unreal. Blue eyes like Arctic frost, jaw sharp enough to wound, lips unsmiling, she realized this wasn't a dream. Luca Kingsley, the infamous young millionaire who rarely appeared in the tabloids unless it was business or scandal, sat up wordlessly, pulling on a white dress shirt as casually as if this absurdity was routine, and with the calmness of a man who had everything and nothing to lose, he muttered, "You snore when you're drunk." It was then that reality slapped her fully across the face, and she scrambled to find answers, demanding to know what happened, how, and why. But he offered only fragments. There had been drinks, laughter, a dare, an officiant who didn't ask questions, and two wounded strangers who sought comfort in chaos. She begged for an annulment, her voice shaking with panic, but Luca's icy gaze didn't flinch. He leaned against the window, watching the city below like it owed him something, and replied with merciless calm, "No." She blinked, stunned, thinking she must have misheard, but when she repeated her plea, he turned fully to her and said, "This marriage may be inconvenient, but it's real and legally binding." Her chest tightened as he proposed a deal with cold logic. Stay married for 6 months, follow his rules, attend a few social events, and walk away with enough money to never worry again. But Scarlett wasn't driven by greed. She wasn't a pawn, and she certainly didn't want to be trapped in a world made of crystal chandeliers and silent expectations. Yet Luca wasn't giving her a choice. His voice was calm, but something darker simmered beneath it, a bitterness born from betrayal and loss. A man who once loved too deeply and now trusted no one. Scarlett saw it, the war behind his eyes, the steel cage around his heart. And though she wanted to scream, to run, to undo the irreversible, something in her stilled. Maybe it was the vulnerability she glimpsed behind his composure, or the strange comfort of not being the only broken soul in the room, or maybe it was fear, the kind that made you freeze, not flee. She wasn't used to being powerless, but in that moment, wrapped in silence and silk and the scent of a stranger who now legally owned a part of her life, she realized she had stumbled into a world she wasn't prepared for. Luca wasn't a man who offered explanations. He offered contracts. He didn't ask for trust. He demanded compliance. And yet, despite everything, Scarlett couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting hadn't been entirely accidental, that perhaps fate, cruel and reckless, had orchestrated their collision, not as a mistake, but as a consequence. She agreed to the deal, her voice barely a whisper, unsure whether she was sealing her own prison sentence or stepping into a path that might rewrite everything she thought she knew about pain, love, and the cost of survival. As she stood in the marble bathroom alone that night, staring at her reflection, bare face, swollen eyes, red ring imprint on her skin, Scarlett realized the woman in the mirror wasn't the same anymore. The old her was gone, lost somewhere between the tequila and the vow she didn't mean. Outside, Luca poured himself a drink, staring into the liquid like it held answers he'd long stopped searching for. And for a long moment, the only sound in the suite was the distant hum of the Vegas lights and the echo of two strangers locked together by a moment they could never take back. Scarlett wasn't sure if she'd stumbled into a fairy tale gone wrong, or the opening chapter of a love story so messy it hurt to even imagine the ending. But one thing was certain. She had just married a cold-hearted millionaire, and walking away would be anything but easy. Scarlett stood beneath the towering glass archway of the Kingsley estate, the salty breeze of the Hamptons lost in the suffocating quiet of the mansion that now bore her name, but not her presence, its halls echoing with silence louder than any scream. And though the estate shimmered with manicured perfection, gold chandeliers dripping elegance from vaulted ceilings, polished marble floors reflecting the ghosts of the past, and luxury vehicles sleeping in garages like caged beasts, it all felt lifeless, a palace wrapped in velvet sorrow. The staff, cold and reserved, glanced past her as if she were a decorative fixture, bowing without warmth, offering polite smiles with hollow eyes, and when she attempted conversation, her words vanished into a void of obligation and whispers, their loyalty tethered tightly to Luca, not her. He was a shadow in the halls, appearing at odd hours with a phone glued to his ear, his voice low and clipped, disappearing into locked rooms and reappearing with the same polished detachment that both intrigued and exhausted her. He never called her Scarlett, only Mrs. Kingsley, like she was a title in his strategy, not a living, breathing woman with shattering thoughts. Every corner of the house whispered of secrets, doors she wasn't allowed to open, portraits that stared too long, and a tension in the air so thick it made her spine ache. The east wing was always sealed, protected by a biometric lock and an invisible boundary of unease. And when she asked about it one morning, Luca's expression shifted only slightly. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed thin, and he replied, "It's irrelevant," dismissing her with the kind of finality that dared her to push further, yet warned her not to. But it wasn't just the locked door. There were photographs in the study, black and white and tucked into drawers she wasn't meant to find, of a woman with haunting eyes and auburn hair, her smile half-hearted, her gaze disturbingly similar to Scarlett's own. She wasn't paranoid, she was observant, and as the days stretched into uncomfortable routine, she pieced together fragments of a puzzle buried under years of secrecy. Rumors of a fiancé who vanished after a scandal, whispers from former business associates who were never named, and documents she glimpsed during a midnight wander, stamped with legal threats and sealed in blood-red folders. But what haunted her most weren't the mysteries locked in vaults. It was Luca himself. Beneath his tailored suits and calculated calm, she sensed fractures, real, raw pain, hidden not in outbursts, but in avoidance. Late at night, when the storm winds howled and the power flickered, she would hear him, the gasps in his sleep, the muffled groans, like a man trapped in a memory that wouldn't release him. And once, just once, she pushed open his door without knocking, only to find him curled on the edge of his bed, shirt drenched in sweat, eyes wide with fear she had never seen before. When she reached for him, gently, instinctively, he recoiled, not out of anger but panic, as if touch itself was a knife, and that's when she knew his wounds weren't visible, but buried in bone. Scarlett began to learn his rhythms, not through words but absence, the way he clenched his fist when lawyers called, the way he paused too long staring at untouched plates, or how his voice lowered just before dismissing her. He was ice, yes, but not dead. Something flickered when he looked at her too long, something he didn't dare acknowledge. And her? She started to feel things she hated admitting. Curiosity turned to concern, and concern quietly bloomed into a quiet ache. Not love, not yet, but a dangerous yearning she couldn't label. She told herself it was empathy, perhaps pity, but the truth stung deeper. She was starting to fall for a man who didn't even want to be touched. She watched him with the eyes of someone hoping to be seen, yet fearing what the reflection might show. And in her loneliness, she began to write again, old habits resurfacing, pouring her pain into ink, composing letters she never sent, journaling things like, "He breathes in numbers but bleeds in silence," and hiding them in books she knew he wouldn't touch. Each day felt like a lifetime suspended in glass. She smiled at staff who didn't respond, ate meals alone in rooms built for 20, and wore dresses selected by a stylist who referred to her only as the placeholder wife. Yet beneath all the isolation, she sensed change, a slow crack forming in Luca's perfectly polished armor. Once she sneezed during breakfast, and he handed her a napkin without speaking, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and it burned. Another time, she found him standing by the grand piano, not playing, just staring at the keys like they held a memory he couldn't relive. And she realized something quietly devastating. This man, for all his power, was deeply, tragically alone. She wasn't the only prisoner in this gilded cage. He was trapped too, by the ghosts of trust broken and love lost in ways he never explained. One evening, as the sun melted into the Atlantic and shadows stretched across the halls, Scarlett leaned against the cold glass of her bedroom window and whispered to herself, "I was supposed to walk away from this, but I think I walked into something I can't undo." And in that silent golden cage, she finally understood. She was no longer a visitor in his world. She was part of it now. Whether he wanted her to be or not, and whether she could survive it, was another story entirely. Scarlett stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the satin strap of her emerald gown, her fingers trembling slightly as she reminded herself to smile, to breathe, to be poised, because tonight was her first chance to be seen not as a stranger or a contract, but as someone worthy, someone belonging in the opulent world she had unwillingly stepped into. The estate buzzed with preparations for the dinner, a rare gathering of the elusive Kingsley family. And though the staff moved with robotic precision, Scarlett felt like an intruder watching a machine she didn't know how to operate. But she held on to hope, foolish or not, that perhaps kindness could break through even the iciest bloodlines. She descended the marble staircase with practiced grace, her heels clicking against the cold floor, her heart hammering beneath lace and hope. And when she entered the grand dining room, she was met not with warmth, but with glances sharp enough to slit silk. Luca's mother sat at the head of the table, her posture regal, her smile tight, her pearls gleaming like armor, while his brother lounged with the air of a man entertained by destruction, and his sister, an elegant statue in navy, offered only silence, her eyes scanning Scarlett as if she were an auction item to be discarded. Scarlett greeted them with gentle words, offering her hand with a tremble hidden beneath polite warmth. But the moment she touched Luca's mother's fingertips, the woman pulled back slightly, as if her skin had brushed something contaminated. The meal began, filled with silver cutlery and tense laughter, and Scarlett tried, she really tried, to talk about books, charities, even Luca's business. But every word she spoke was met with curt replies or veiled jabs. Then it happened. His mother's voice cut through the dining room like a blade dipped in poison. "Another gold digger, Luca," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, dabbing her lips delicately as if she hadn't just humiliated someone in their own home. The room fell into a cruel, delighted silence, broken only by the sound of his brother's low chuckle. "Hope this one doesn't ruin our name like the last," he added, raising his glass with mock celebration, eyes gleaming with bitter memory. Scarlett's face flushed, but she said nothing, waiting, aching for Luca to speak, to rise, to defend, to say something, anything. But he simply reached for his wine and sipped, cold and composed, as if the entire dinner were an uncomfortable business meeting, not a character assassination of the woman sitting beside him. Her appetite vanished, her fingers clenched beneath the tablecloth, and when the dinner finally ended, dragging like a slow bleed, she walked upstairs ahead of him, not waiting, not pretending. That night she waited in their room, still in her gown, makeup cracked, eyes burning, the words clawing inside her until they spilled out the moment he entered. "You let them humiliate me," she whispered, voice shaking not with anger, but betrayal. Luca didn't flinch, didn't soften, just removed his cufflinks and met her gaze with glacial indifference. "Don't expect protection from someone who doesn't believe in love," he said flatly, as if emotions were a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. The silence that followed was louder than any scream, and when he turned away, she realized the walls between them had grown taller. But colder things had started to melt too. That night she lay alone in their bed, her face buried in silk pillows soaked with silent tears, her chest aching not just from his cruelty, but from the terrifying realization that she wanted his defense. Not because she needed validation, but because, somehow, she had started to care. Down the hall, Luca sat in the dark of his study, the fire crackling before him, but offering no warmth. He poured whiskey with a steady hand, but his jaw was clenched, his eyes lost in memory. Not of Scarlett crying, but of another woman once broken by the weight of his family's expectations. A woman he couldn't save, and the guilt that never left him. He told himself he was protecting Scarlett by staying cold, by not getting involved, by not making promises he couldn't keep. But deep down, something inside him shifted, barely noticeable, like a hairline crack forming in glass. Pain had always been his armor, but now it was letting light in. Scarlett fell asleep alone, but not untouched by the echo of his absence. Lucas stood in silence watching the closed door of their bedroom from down the hall, fingers twitching, breath shallow, remembering the way she looked tonight, elegant, earnest, trying to belong. And though he told himself she meant nothing, he felt it, the first sting of doubt. For the first time in years, someone had wanted to fight beside him, not for money, not for image, but because she hoped for something human. And maybe, just maybe, he realized, she deserved more than silence. The silence that had fallen over the Kingsley mansion since the disastrous dinner still lingered like a haunting echo, and Scarlett, restless beneath the weight of unanswered questions and the chill of emotional distance, found herself wandering its endless halls long after midnight, the shadows stretching with secrets, the marble cold beneath her bare feet as she drifted toward the forbidden East Wing, the part of the house Luca always avoided and the staff never cleaned when he was home. And to her surprise, the door creaked open without resistance, revealing a study that felt untouched by time, filled with dust, darkness, and an unsettling stillness that sent a shiver through her spine. Curiosity overpowered fear as she stepped inside, drawn not by defiance, but by the gnawing ache of needing to understand the man who shared her bed, yet felt like a ghost she was chasing through smoke. The study smelled faintly of old paper and expensive cologne, and her eyes were immediately drawn to a steel vault set into the wall, its heavy door inexplicably ajar, the cold metal catching the faint moonlight like a beacon of danger and truth. Scarlett's heartbeat quickened, each thud echoing in her ears as she reached out and pulled it fully open, expecting nothing, fearing everything. And inside, she found file boxes stacked neatly, marked with initials, codes, and dates, their silence more deafening than screams. She rifled through them until one file stopped her breath cold. Her name, printed in stark capital letters, Scarlett Monroe, background check. And with trembling fingers, she opened it to find her life laid bare in cruel, calculated detail. Every address she had lived at since childhood, her school records, her parents' divorce papers, her medical files, things she hadn't told anyone, not even her closest friends. A photo of her from 3 years ago tucked into a corner like evidence, as if she were part of an investigation, not a person. She turned each page with growing dread, her stomach twisting, her throat tightening, her sense of privacy violated in ways she couldn't articulate. It wasn't just surveillance. It was dissection. Every piece of her broken down, categorized and judged. And then she felt it, that silent presence behind her like a change in air pressure. And she turned to see Luca standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Not surprised, not angry, just prepared. For a long moment, neither spoke. And then, with terrifying calm, he said, "I had to make sure you weren't like her." Scarlett's voice was low but sharp. "Like who?" she asked, needing to understand the kind of woman who could turn a man into stone. Luca stepped closer, and for the first time, there was something human in his eyes. Not rage, not arrogance, but a flicker of a wound so old it bled without bleeding. "The woman who pretended to love me," he said quietly. "The one who gained my trust, only to use it to nearly destroy my family, my business, my life. She knew where to cut. She made me believe it was love when all she wanted was power." His voice cracked on the last word, barely perceptible, But to Scarlett, it was as loud as a confession. The man who never faltered was unraveling before her in fragments. His armor, so polished and cold, showed its first fracture. She should have felt rage, betrayal, even fear. But instead, the emotion that rose inside her was worse. Pity, sharp and tender. Because beneath his cruelty was not malice but pain, deep and unhealed. She suddenly understood why he built walls instead of homes, why he kept his distance even when she was inches away. This wasn't about control, it was about defense. And though he had spied on her, investigated her, and stripped her bare on paper, she saw now it wasn't about her at all. It was about ghosts. Still, the pity made her feel smaller than anger ever could. She closed the file gently, not slamming it, not tearing it, just placing it back in the vault as if closing a casket. "You didn't have to hurt me to protect yourself," she whispered, the hurt in her voice not from the invasion, but from the fact that he expected her to be a villain without giving her a chance to prove she wasn't. Luca said nothing. His eyes followed her as she walked past him, back through the door, back into the cold halls of a home that still didn't feel like hers. But this time the silence wasn't just about what wasn't said, it was about everything that now lingered between them. Exposed pain, unspoken apologies, and the fragile, flickering possibility of something real, if they dared let go of fear. The storm came without warning, thick clouds swallowing the moon, wind howling through the tall pines that lined the estate, and rain pelting the windows with a furious rhythm like nature trying to speak what their hearts never could. The sudden blackout plunged the mansion into darkness, flickering candles the only light as Scarlett stood at the base of the stairs, unsure whether to retreat to her room or venture into the unknown. And then, through the dim hallway, she saw him, Luca, unguarded, sitting by the window with a glass of untouched whiskey, the storm reflecting in his blue eyes. No title, no control, just a man unraveling. He didn't look at her as she approached, but he didn't stop her either. She sat across from him in silence, the quiet between them louder than thunder. "I hated the dark as a child," she said softly, her voice steady. "It made everything I was afraid of feel closer." He glanced at her then, something flickering in his gaze. "I used to love it," he replied, "until it became the only place I could hide." She told him about growing up in a trailer park, about parents who forgot her birthday but remembered the liquor store, about learning to be her own anchor before she even knew how to swim. He listened, not with pity, but with a stillness that felt sacred. Then, without prompting, he spoke, words falling like pieces of a puzzle he'd locked away. About the woman he once trusted, who kissed his brother behind his back and laughed when confronted. About the way his family turned it into a scandal, and how every time someone said love, it sounded like a threat. "I can't feel anymore," he whispered, the words so fragile they almost disappeared into the storm. But Scarlett reached out, not to fix him, not to pity, but to anchor him the way she'd once anchored herself. "Then let me remind you how," she answered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with honesty. There was no kiss, no passionate embrace. They sat together, knees barely touching, hearts slowly reaching across the void. When his hand finally covered hers, it was like a lifeline tossed into dark waters. Not romantic, but redemptive. They stayed like that, talking about things that never made it into headlines or background checks. His fear of turning into his father, her dreams of becoming a teacher, the way loneliness eats slower than heartbreak, but cuts deeper. At some point, the storm softened, but they didn't notice. The silence between them had shifted, from hollow to healing. Hours passed, the candle burned low, and Luca, for the first time, looked at Scarlett not as a stranger in his house, but as the only person who hadn't tried to break him. They parted in the hallway, quietly with no promises. But later that night, as Scarlett lay staring at the ceiling, sleep teasing the edges of her thoughts, she heard it. His voice, quiet through the wall, wrapped in sleep, unfiltered and soft. Scarlett. Just her name, but it felt like a key turning in a lock neither of them had dared open. And in that moment, with her heart thudding quietly in the dark, she knew the walls between them hadn't fallen. But for the first time, they'd cracked. The warmth of that whispered name still echoed in Scarlett's heart when the coldest blow landed. Brutal, public, and deliberate. She'd barely finished breakfast when Luca stormed into the study, phone in hand, his blue eyes not ice this time, but fire. He didn't speak at first. He just played the video. Scarlett, drunk in Vegas, laughing uncontrollably in a too-short dress, being cheered on by faceless voices, stumbling into a chapel with a plastic tiara tilted on her head. Someone behind the camera shouting, "Dare you to marry a stranger for fun?" Her face turned ghostly as it ended, but Luca's had already hardened into marble. "So it was a joke to you?" he hissed, every syllable wrapped in acid. "No," she pleaded, shaking her head. "I didn't even remember that dare until now, I swear." But the damage had clawed its way deep into his already wounded soul. "You used me," he whispered, not with rage but betrayal. "Just like she did." And with that, the walls rose again, higher, colder, crueler than before. The lights in the house seemed dimmer. The rooms echoed with the ache of silence. Scarlett tried to speak to him, but he wouldn't even look at her. She passed him in the halls like a ghost no longer welcome in his world. The staff avoided eye contact. Meals went untouched. Her bedroom became a prison of whispers and unanswered questions. But beneath Luca's hard exterior, something far more dangerous was unraveling. He wasn't just angry, he was haunted. Torn between his growing feelings and the trauma of betrayal that had burned him once before. And still, a flicker of doubt crept in. Why now? Why leak the video after months of silence? Why with such perfect timing, just when they had begun to connect? He contacted a private investigator secretly, determined to pull back every veil. Scarlett, unaware, cried in the shower until her skin shriveled, wondering how love could almost begin only to die again. Meanwhile, Lucas stared at the file dropped on his desk days later, heart in his throat. The footage wasn't leaked randomly. It had come from a disguised account, traced back to a burner device. But the metadata, the tiny breadcrumbs left behind, led straight to someone he hadn't seen in years. A name he hoped never to see again. Victoria Sterling, his ex-fiancée, the same woman who had shattered his trust and reputation, now resurfaced with a vengeance. And worse, she hadn't just come for him. She had her claws aimed at Scarlett too. In that moment, the truth no longer set him free. It chained him to guilt, because he realized he'd pushed away the only woman who had stayed, while the one who left was still pulling the strings. Scarlett stood by the doorway of the grand estate, the very walls that once echoed silence now whispering goodbye. Her suitcase by her side, and her trembling hands gripping the handle like it was the only thing anchoring her. The rain had stopped, but her tears hadn't, falling freely as her eyes met Luca's one last time across the vast marble floor where they had first avoided each other, where they had accidentally fallen into fate. "I didn't marry you for money, Luca," she said, her voice quivering but resolute. The kind of voice that carries truth even when it's breaking. "I didn't stay for luxury. I stayed because somewhere between your silence and your sorrow, I started to feel like I mattered." Her words cut deeper than any betrayal ever had. Luca, once known for never showing emotion, stood still as stone, until his fingers reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a folded, weather-worn photograph. Edges torn, emotions frayed. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a younger version of himself, standing unknowingly on the edge of betrayal, while behind his back, his ex-fiancée, Victoria, held hands with his own brother. Dated, time-stamped, the very week he had proposed. A visible shudder ran through his chest as he handed the photo to Scarlett, the silence between them now thick with realization. "You never betrayed me," he murmured, voice stripped of its armor, soft as rain on old wounds. "They did. And I punished the only person who never tried to hurt me." His words didn't beg for forgiveness. They bled for it. He dropped to his knees, not in grandeur, not in dramatics, but in surrender. "I can't offer flowers and poetry," he continued, voice cracking as his heart stepped out from the shadows. "But I offer something better, a love that didn't come easy, a love that grew through pain, silence, misunderstanding, and truth. A love I never knew I was capable of until you. Scarlett's knees buckled under the weight of everything. Of the nights she cried behind locked doors. Of the accusations, the tension, the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd see her. And he had. Finally. She dropped to her knees beside him, not for another vow, not for a performative gesture, but to meet him eye to eye, heart to heart. There was no ring exchange, no audience, just two broken people who had finally found home in each other's arms. He reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate. No hesitation, no fear. Just the quiet, brave kind of love that grows when everything else is stripped away. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, the choice had been made, and what remained was forever.